Good evening. If you've stumbled in expecting murder, mayhem, or a thrilling tale of intrigue, well, I'm afraid you've been slightly misled. Yes, this is the story of a toothbrush that in all likelihood contributed to a man's unfortunate and untimely death. But let me reassure you from the start, no one is coming to get you. There will be no jump scares, no urgent plot twists, and certainly no need to sit bolt upright in bed. Instead, I invite you to lean back, loosen your shoulders, perhaps allow your jaw to unclench, and let us wander together, slowly, deliberately, through the long and oddly dignified history of the humble toothbrush. Before we drift too far, go ahead and like this video and subscribe so you can find your way back the next time you're wide awake at an entirely unreasonable hour. And if you're feeling sociable, drop a comment below with the time and your location. We rather enjoy knowing who else is awake and why. Over the next 2 hours, we shall examine this bristled stick in more detail than is strictly necessary. We will wander gently, aimlessly, through dusty drawers, forgotten patents, and questionable Victorian dental advice. There will be bone, there will be boar hair. There may, I warn you now, be a brief discussion of gums. But above all, there will be time. Time to breathe, time to rest, time to remember that nothing is especially urgent when you are discussing a toothbrush from 1783. Yes, a toothbrush may once have killed a man. But here, tonight, in the warm flicker of the fireplace, that same toothbrush might just help you fall asleep. So if you're listening in bed, or curled up on the sofa, or simply trying to escape the endless churn of a modern Tuesday, you are most welcome. This is the toothbrush that killed. And we begin, as all good stories do, not with a crime scene, but with a stick. A stick from Babylon. Let us begin, as promised, with a stick. Not a particularly special stick, at first glance. Roughly the length of your finger. A little chewed at the end, possibly pulled from a bush by someone with very little time and even less access to mint. This, dear listener, is the ancestor of the modern toothbrush, and it has been with us longer than you might expect. The earliest known example comes from ancient Babylon. Yes, Babylon, land of hanging gardens, cuneiform tablets, and evidently mild dental awareness. As early as 3500 BCE, Babylonians were using what we now call chew sticks, twigs frayed at one end, used to scrub the teeth and gums. Simple, portable, no Bluetooth required. From Babylon we drift east to ancient China. By the time of the Tang dynasty, around the 7th century, the Chinese had refined the idea considerably. They fashioned small handles from bamboo or bone, and they affixed to them stiff bristles, often from hogs, a proper brush by most definitions. It had a handle. It had bristles. It almost certainly had an odor, but it worked. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, another oral hygiene tradition had taken root. Quite literally, the miswak, a slender twig from the Salvadora persica tree. Naturally antibacterial, naturally fibrous, and used to this day in many parts of the world. No paste, no charger, no packaging, nature's own toothbrush. The Egyptians had their own methods. They preferred powders, a blend of crushed ox hooves, eggshells, ashes, and myrrh, which sounds less like dental care and more like the recipe for summoning a minor spirit. These were applied with the fingers, or with cloth, or again with twigs. Greeks and Romans had their take as well: silver toothpicks, bronze probes, a touch of mint, a lot of hubris. They believed in cleaning the teeth, certainly. They just hadn't quite agreed on how. It is worth noting that Aristotle himself may have offered advice on tooth care, though one must remember he also had opinions on meteorology, dreams, and eels. So perhaps take it with a grain of salt. Across all these ancient civilizations, one thing is remarkably consistent: human beings, who often ignored basic sanitation altogether, nonetheless tried to do something, anything, about their teeth, which says something, perhaps about vanity, perhaps about pain, or perhaps simply about the universal desire not to smell awful. To recap, the Babylonians chewed sticks, the Chinese added bristles, the Romans used metal, the Egyptians preferred powders, and no one, absolutely no one, used floss. Not yet. And so ends our first chapter, not with applause, but with a quiet nod to the forgotten twigs that started it all. If the Babylonians gave us the idea and the Egyptians gave us the paste, then it was the Chinese who gave us something recognizably modern. The earliest bristle toothbrush, as we might picture it today, emerged in China during the Tang dynasty around the year 619. It consisted of a small carved handle made of bone or bamboo and a head densely packed with coarse hairs taken from the back of a wild hog. Imagine, if you will, the texture of boar bristle: stiff, wiry, slightly oily, and not exactly fragrant. A far cry from today's pastel plastic and mint-scented foam. But effective? Yes, very much so. It worked because of its firmness. The bristles could actually scrape pluck from the teeth and massage the gums, albeit with all the tenderness of a small hedgehog. And the Chinese were not merely brushing at random. There were oral hygiene rituals, morning routines, toothbrush holders, instructional texts. Brushes were sometimes boiled or left in vinegar to keep them clean, and yes, they were replaced from time to time. This was not some isolated eccentricity. It was, for many, daily life. There is evidence that Chinese scholars and nobles kept elaborate grooming kits. They were stored in lacquered boxes, decorated with characters and inlays. Next to writing brushes, hair combs, and tiny flasks of perfume, there would be, often as not, a toothbrush. By the 15th century, the design had migrated. It moved westward, likely along trade routes and through cultural exchange, but the Western world was, as we shall see, a bit slower to warm to the idea. A boar hair brush, for the mouth, too crude, too foreign, too odd. And yet, the Chinese had already solved the problem. How to take a stick and make it a tool, a proper tool, a brush, not for painting, not for calligraphy, but for the quiet, daily, thoroughly unglamorous act of cleaning the teeth. A ritual now so common, it's almost invisible. And so to the Chinese we offer a small bow for turning twigs into tools and hygiene into habit. Next we travel west to where bristles were once considered barbaric and cleanliness was often a matter of prayer. In the arid landscapes of the Arabian Peninsula, long before the hum of electric toothbrushes and the buzz of dental apps, there was the miswak, a twig, simple, fragrant, undefeated by time. The miswak comes from the Salvadora persica tree, also known with admirable confidence as the toothbrush tree. Its branches, when trimmed and chewed at one end, fray into fine fibers, perfect for scrubbing, gentle on the gums, naturally antibacterial. But more than that, it was sacred. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is said to have used the miswak regularly, before prayer, before entering the home, before speaking. It was more than hygiene, it was reverence. Hadiths, oral traditions, mention his use of the twig, often and enthusiastically. It is reported that he said, "If I had not found it hard for my followers, I would have ordered them to clean their teeth with the miswak before every prayer, 5 times a day, if possible." Not merely a recommendation, a habit, a rhythm of cleanliness built into the fabric of the day. And unlike boar bristles or bone handles, the miswak required nothing more than a tree and a little attention. It was democratic, portable, biodegradable. Even today you'll find miswak sold in open-air markets, often wrapped in plastic, which rather defeats the point. Dentists, interestingly, have confirmed its value. The twig contains fluoride, silica, and essential oils. It cleans, it freshens, it polishes, it even whitens, though, to be clear, in the natural way, not in the glossy, chemically alarming sort of way one sees on toothpaste adverts. In many Muslim communities, the miswak has never gone out of use. You may find it tucked behind the ear of an imam or nestled beside prayer beads. Its use is both personal and public, hygiene as devotion, cleanliness as quiet worship. And so, in the long history of dental care, we pause here, not to marvel at innovation, but to acknowledge wisdom. A stick from a tree, used not for appearance, but for presence, not for whitening, but for waking, not for vanity, but for reverence. There is a long, strange thread tying together beauty and the mouth. Before dental care became medical, it was aesthetic. And before it was aesthetic, it was spiritual. The mouth, open or closed, has always been a site of fascination, of vanity, of scrutiny. In ancient China, a white, unblemished smile was associated with elegance and nobility. Imperial women blackened their teeth deliberately, not because they were decayed, but because the practice, known as ohaguro, signified wealth, adulthood, and romantic availability. A mouth stained pitch black with iron vinegar solution might seem startling now, but in its time, it was a mark of refinement, of control. In Japan, the practice continued into the 19th century, with even men in the samurai class participating. It was not about hygiene, nor even about beauty in the modern sense. It was about symbolism, permanence, a kind of deliberate transformation of the body. Meanwhile, in ancient Egypt, white teeth were favored, but not through brushing, through powders. Crushed pumice, mixed with wine vinegar or burned eggshells, was used to polish the teeth and sweeten the breath. Mint was sometimes added, not to clean, but to mask the living smell of the human mouth. A noble woman's smile wasn't necessarily healthy, it was simply convincing. And in India, long before fluoride, people chewed on twigs of the neem tree, not just for function, but for flavor, for the feeling of freshness. In Ayurvedic texts, the condition of the mouth was tied to the energy of the body, a kind of oral balance tied to diet, temperament, and spiritual alignment. A fragrant mouth meant a steady mind. The Greeks and Romans, for their part, were obsessed with rhetoric, and therefore with breath. If one was to speak in the forum, if one was to woo or persuade or recite, one had to smell pleasant while doing it. Cloths soaked in myrrh, bark chewed before dinner, and pastes rubbed gently onto the tongue. These were the unsung steps in an orator's ritual. Breath mattered, not because it was clean, but because it was close. Beauty, in this context, wasn't about symmetry or sparkle. It was about intimacy. The mouth was a threshold, and the air that passed through it was, in many cultures, considered sacred. And so, we find the same pattern again and again. People didn't necessarily want clean teeth. They wanted appealing ones. They didn't need sterile mouths. They wanted sweet ones. Oral care was not a medical act. It was a social one. And like so many things in history, it was never really about the thing itself. It was about how it made other people feel. Next, we turn to Egypt, where the concern was not spiritual, but alchemical. If Babylon gave us twigs and China gave us bristles, then ancient Egypt gave us powder. Not the sort of powder one might pat onto the cheeks, but a more abrasive affair, designed with some enthusiasm to scrub the teeth into gleaming compliance. The Egyptians were nothing if not thorough. Their tooth-cleaning powders were made from a mixture of crushed ox hooves, burnt eggshells, pumice, ashes, and, because no spell is complete without it, a dash of myrrh. It sounds dreadful, and it probably was, but it worked. The logic was clear. If something was hard, brittle, and vaguely sacred, it might help remove the residue of yesterday's bread and onions. The powders were rubbed on with fingers or with cloth, and sometimes with, yes, a twig. We often picture ancient Egyptians as preoccupied with death, but they were equally invested in appearances, cleanliness, fragrance, and orderly presentation of self. Their tombs were filled not only with treasures and scrolls, but with cosmetics, combs, razors, and dental tools. There are even reports, faint but compelling, of early toothbrush-like instruments found in tombs, near jars of powdered abrasives. Tools of the afterlife, or at least a sign that no one wanted to meet the gods with bad breath. This wasn't merely vanity. In the Egyptian worldview, the body was sacred. To decay was natural, but to do so with dignity, perhaps, was divine. Their approach to oral care reflects this balance between ritual and realism. Of course, there were limits. They had no true understanding of bacteria. Tooth decay was often blamed on curses or spirits, but still, they tried. They tried to clean, to polish, to prepare themselves for judgment, both earthly and otherwise. One must admire the effort, to crush a hoof, to burn an eggshell, to mix it all with myrrh, and then scrub one's mouth in the name of grace. Today, such a blend would not pass FDA approval. It would likely raise eyebrows even in the most experimental corners of the internet. But for its time, it was advanced, thorough, and strangely elegant. And so, to the Egyptians, we offer a dusty nod for bringing a kind of alchemy to the art of the clean tooth. Next, we sail west to Greece and Rome, where mint met metal and oral hygiene got just a little philosophical. The Greeks and Romans were no strangers to the art of presentation. They valued rhetoric, sculpture, and the ideal human form. And so, it is perhaps no surprise that they eventually turned their attention, however briefly, to the teeth. Though they lacked toothbrushes in the modern sense, they had their own instruments, toothpicks, often made of silver, sometimes of bronze, occasionally, if you were very wealthy indeed, of gold. These were not disposable plastic slivers. They were tools of refinement, status symbols, carefully carried, often engraved, sometimes passed down. The Romans in particular believed in the value of a good toothpick. They would use it not only to dislodge food, but as part of a post-meal grooming routine. The act of cleaning one's teeth, even in public, was not frowned upon. It was considered civilized, almost theatrical. But there were other methods too. They used cloths soaked in vinegar. They chewed on aromatic bark. They experimented with pastes made from crushed bones, oyster shells, and, occasionally, the ashes of burned animals. Mint was added when available. Not for whitening, but for breath, freshness, decorum. And the philosophers, of course, had opinions. Some debated the humors of the mouth, whether too much bile might turn the teeth yellow, whether melancholy might rot them altogether. Pliny the Elder recommended using the ashes of a burned mouse. It is unclear whether this was satire or simply the standard of Roman science. There is some suggestion that Hippocrates, yes, that Hippocrates, devised a form of mouthwash, a blend of wine and herbs, swished, not swallowed, unless, of course, you are having a particularly stressful day. For the Greeks and Romans, the mouth was a place of importance, not merely for chewing, but for speaking. To clean it was not only practical, but philosophical, a kind of preparation for dialogue, for poetry, for politics. Still, they never quite reached the point of a proper brush. There were no bristles, no handles, no helpful posters instructing children to scrub for 2 minutes. But the intention was there. The tools were coming. The habit was forming. And so to the Greeks and Romans we offer a nod of amused respect for their silver picks, their vinegars and pastes, and their willingness to debate everything, even halitosis. It is easy to forget that the mouth, to the ancients, was not just a passage for food. It was an instrument of logic, a vessel of the soul, and in certain schools of thought, something not entirely separate from the divine. The philosophers of antiquity had plenty to say about teeth, about breath, about the mouth, as a space where matter met meaning. Galen, the famed Roman physician and thinker, wrote that teeth were not merely bones but tools designed for both survival and speech. He believed their form mirrored divine order, molars for grinding, canines for tearing, and incisors for elegance. A damaged tooth, then, wasn't just painful. It disrupted the symmetry of the cosmos, a kind of miniature tragedy. Socrates, though less dental in focus, believed the mouth to be central to virtue. What one said revealed who one was. The tongue, he said, was sharper than any sword, and thus must be disciplined. There is some irony in imagining Socrates swishing vinegar to mask halitosis before delivering moral sermons, but perhaps he did. Others, like Aristotle, dabbled in odd theories. He speculated that tooth decay might be caused by excessive bile in the body or the imbalance of elemental humors. If your teeth ached, it was a sign not of plaque, but of emotional disturbance, an excess of melancholy, a life poorly aligned. This idea that the state of the mouth reflected the state of the mind proved difficult to dislodge, even as science advanced. Echoes of these early beliefs remained. Bad teeth meant bad character. Halitosis suggested guilt. A crooked smile was quite literally suspicious. In medieval monasteries, monks were known to cleanse their mouths before prayer, not for hygiene, but for humility. Breath was an offering, and it was believed that the soul could exit through the mouth at death. Better it be clean. There is something touching about all this, however inaccurate, however odd, the belief that our mouths, and what emerges from them, carry moral weight. That to care for one's breath is not merely hygienic, but ethical, philosophical, a small, daily form of self-governance. Of course, these thinkers knew nothing of bacteria, or enamel erosion, or fluoride, but they understood better than most that the mouth is never just a body part. It is, in every era, a declaration. Next, we enter darker days. where progress slows and superstition rises. A time of saints and serfs, of tooth fairies and tooth pliers. The Middle Ages. Before antiseptic mouthwash and television adverts, there were myths. Toothaches were not caused by bacteria, but by spirits. Tiny demons, even worms. Yes, worms. The idea of the toothworm dates back millennia. It appears in Sumerian texts, in ancient Indian writings, and, most stubbornly, in the folklore of medieval Europe. A small creature, it was said, that burrowed into your tooth and gnawed. It explained the pain, the rot, the strange way a tooth could seem fine one day and crumbling the next. No microscope was needed, just imagination. And so rituals were devised. Incantations were spoken, poultices applied. Some tried oil, some tried prayers. Others attempted to smoke the worm out using heated metal tools. This went about as well as one might expect. There were also charms, amulets, and in some regions, a sharp slap to the face to drive the spirit away. Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry, was called upon for protection. Her own teeth, legend says, were violently removed during martyrdom. Naturally, this made her an ideal spiritual ally for anyone suffering an abscess. But even saints had their limits. In some villages, it was customary to bury lost teeth beneath the hearth or toss them onto the roof to keep the devil from claiming them. If you're detecting early echoes of the tooth fairy, you're not wrong. The fairy was originally less a charming sprite and more a deterrent, a spirit of household order who ensured the proper disposal of body parts. As oral care waned in the Middle Ages, superstition rushed in to fill the gap, and without access to proper tools, people did what people always do. They made meaning from pain, from loss, from teeth. Before science, there was imagination. And when it came to toothaches, imagination was often the most potent medicine available. It wasn't that people didn't try to help themselves. Quite the opposite. They tried everything, which is, unfortunately, the problem. One popular medieval remedy involved holding a toad against the jaw, dead or alive. Sources differ. Some insisted it must be buried under a full moon first. Others claimed it worked best if worn in a pouch around the neck. Why a toad? No one knows. Possibly because it looked unpleasant, much like the ache itself. Another favoured treatment involved goat's urine, warmed slightly and gargled twice daily. If one could not find a goat, or if the goat was less than cooperative, sheep's milk was said to be an acceptable substitute. Some texts recommend combining the two for maximum effect. There were poultices made of ashes mixed with wine, fennel, and, in some recipes, powdered mouse skull. The mixture was then applied directly to the aching tooth. One hopes the smell alone provided distraction. For the brave, there was always fire. Heated metal rods were sometimes placed near the mouth in an attempt to smoke the worm out. The logic was simple. If the pain is unbearable, make something worse. Results were unsurprisingly mixed. Incantations were common. One 10th century remedy involved chanting the name of a local saint while facing east and tapping the tooth with a stick of elderwood. In some regions, children were instructed to whisper secrets into the roots of old trees, asking them to take the pain away. Leeches made an appearance, of course. Not on the gums, though that too was tried, but behind the ears or on the temples, to balance the humours, to draw out the ache, to demonstrate commitment. There was also the method of distraction through trauma. A sharp slap to the face administered by a family member was occasionally recommended. This, it was said, startled the spirit inhabiting the tooth and drove it out. It also startled the patient, which was, in fairness, an effect. And if all else failed, you could always throw your tooth into the fire, accompanied by a short rhyme to keep the devil away, or bury it, or feed it to a dog. Different cultures had different theories. Most were wrong, but all were hopeful. In hindsight, these remedies are absurd. In practice, they were often dangerous, but they speak to something very human, the desire to do something, anything, when faced with invisible pain. They are rituals, really, tiny acts of control in the face of the unknowable. And though we know better now, we also kind of admire the effort.
The tooth fairy, as we know her today, is a relatively recent invention. Wings, glitter, currency exchange. But the tradition of honoring a lost tooth, of transforming it into something symbolic, is ancient and global. In Spain and much of Latin America, she is not a fairy at all. She is a mouse. Ratoncito Perez, or just El Raton, is said to sneak beneath pillows and whisk away baby teeth, leaving behind a coin or a small gift. He wears a waistcoat, sometimes a monocle, and while he predates Disney by decades, he might still be the most charming rodent in oral folklore. In France, he is called La Petite Souris, the little mouse, quiet, efficient, never seen. A sort of dental concierge operating after bedtime. The mouse, it seems, makes practical sense, small enough to visit unnoticed and already associated with gnawing. In Japan, the tradition is more kinetic. If you lose a top tooth, you throw it downward onto the dirt. If it's a bottom tooth, you throw it upward onto the roof. This, it's believed, encourages the new tooth to grow straight and strong, in the right direction. Alignment by gravity, a small act of physics-inflected hope. In Korea, children also toss their teeth onto the roof, but not randomly. They do it while calling out to magpies, asking them to take the old tooth and bring back a better one. Magpies are considered messengers, and so the transaction is both physical and spiritual. In India, some families wrap the tooth in cotton and drop it into a river. Others bury it. Others hide it in a corner of the house. The rituals vary by region and religion, but the impulse remains the same, to part with the body gently, respectfully. Even in Viking societies, there's evidence of warriors carrying their children's teeth as good luck charms, known as tand fee or tooth fee. The gift was sometimes reversed, with the parent paying the child and the child's tooth becoming a talisman. These traditions span continents and centuries, but they all share one thing, the recognition that a tooth, even a tiny one, matters. It is a milestone, a threshold, a strange little death followed by renewal. And so, the fairy, or the mouse, or the magpie, is less about fantasy than it is about reassurance, a reminder to the child that change is safe, that loss has value, that even what falls away can bring something new. The tooth fairy, then, is not just a bedtime figure. She is a quiet philosophy. Next, we enter those very dark days in earnest, to a time of filthy water, rotting gums, and the cheerful clang of iron forceps. Medieval Europe. The term Dark Ages is often unfair. Many things persisted, trade, learning, even certain luxuries. But when it comes to dental hygiene, well, the term fits rather snugly. From roughly the 5th to the 15th century, tooth care in Europe went from rudimentary but earnest to largely neglected. Toothbrushes as we know them had not yet arrived, and while powders and picks had once held sway, many of these tools fell out of favor, or out of reach. People still cleaned their teeth, of course, sometimes, with a cloth, with fingers,
with salt or soot or vinegar, but there was little in the way of routine and less still in the way of science. The Church's influence brought an emphasis on the soul, not the body. Pain was sometimes seen as purifying, or deserved, or simply inevitable, which meant that a rotten molar wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a moral question. And so people lived with it until they couldn't, at which point the village barber surgeon was summoned. A man with a steady hand, a strong arm, and a deep misunderstanding of infection. Tooth extraction was the go-to method. Preventative care was virtually unknown. The tools, pliers, hooks, and occasionally the same instruments used for shoeing horses. There was no anesthetic, no sterile environment, just a chair, a bottle of spirits, and a prayer. Those who could afford it might see a physician, but even there the advice was shaky. Some recommended leeches, others prescribed ground herbs, and a few heroically suggested doing nothing at all. Teeth were considered in many cases a lost cause. Dentures existed of a sort, made from bone or ivory, or in some cases the teeth of the deceased. These were tied together with wire and looked precisely as unsettling as you'd imagine. Hygiene, broadly speaking, was inconsistent. Bathing was infrequent. Water was suspect. And the mouth, that warm, dark cavern, was left largely to its own devices. It's easy, from the comfort of our electric toothbrushes and antiseptic rinse, to scoff at the past. But they were working with what they had, which, to be fair, wasn't much. And so the Dark Ages rolled grimly on, with aching mouths and grinding teeth and a growing desire for something better.
There is something quietly tragic about a toothache. Unlike a wound or a fever, it cannot always be seen, cannot be bandaged, it lingers, and it insists. For much of history, the pain of the mouth was suffered in silence, but not always. Occasionally, it made its way into the written record, and when it did, the result was strangely moving. A window into private agony, framed in careful ink. In 1663, a woman named Anne Fanshawe wrote in her diary, "My jaw burns like brimstone, and I am fit for no company but ghosts." It is unclear what afflicted her, perhaps an abscess, perhaps worse, but the phrasing remains haunting, pain elevated to the level of poetry. A French nobleman writing in 1721 complained that the nerve in his tooth had betrayed him during dinner and turned the finest pheasant to ash. His tone is theatrical, but the sentiment is real. Tooth pain diminishes not only the body, but pleasure itself. Even Benjamin Franklin, that high priest of practicality, wrote of being kept awake, not by the stirring of invention, but by a molar determined to sabotage diplomacy. It seems pain, like politics, respects no schedule. Children, too, left records, though often filtered through parents. A Scottish minister in 1809 noted his son had lost his first tooth and asked if God would still love him with holes in his head. It is both innocent and existential. Letters from the trenches in World War I are filled with aching teeth. Soldiers requested clove oil, not bullets. One wrote home, "My jaw is a second front. The enemy is winning." Pain, when it cannot be stopped, must be shared. And so it was, in journals, in notes, in prayers. These were not cries for help. They were documentation, witness, the body leaving a trace. To read these fragments now is to feel a kind of kinship, across time, across class, across continents. Because in the end, a toothache does not care about titles. It does not care about borders. It does not care whether you are a queen or a cobbler, a soldier or a scholar. It simply arrives and waits to be noticed. And if history is any guide, it always is. Queen Elizabeth I, monarch, icon, trailblazer, toothache sufferer. By all accounts, Elizabeth had a fondness for sugar. Sugared almonds, candied violets, spiced wines, delights of the court, and torment to the molar. Her teeth, it seems, suffered accordingly. By the end of her reign, they were visibly black.
not stained, not discolored, black. There are contemporary reports suggesting she had many teeth removed and that she resisted further extractions with all the might of a queen who knew exactly how unpleasant they were. In one famous account, she refused to allow a royal physician to treat her until he first let her watch him undergo the same procedure. He obliged. The queen was unimpressed. Still, Elizabeth remained a symbol of strength, of style, and, oddly, of dental trends. Her blackened teeth became fashionable. Members of the court would darken their own smiles with soot in imitation of their sovereign. To have bad teeth was, for a time, to be perceived as wealthy, because it meant you had access to sugar. To rot was to rule. It's a strange logic, but then fashion often is. There is no evidence Elizabeth used a toothbrush, but she did use cloths, powders, and the occasional pick. Her grooming rituals were extensive. Wigs, paints, perfumes, tooth care was simply part of the ensemble, however ineffective it may have been. And so we give Queen Elizabeth her due for turning oral decay into a style statement. Sugar is not just a food. It is a history, a currency, a weapon. And when it comes to teeth, it is arguably the most influential substance ever discovered or invented. The early uses were modest. In India, where sugarcane was first domesticated, it was used medicinally, a tonic, a purifier, something rare and carefully handled. But once it made its way west, things changed. By the 16th century, sugar was no longer a curiosity. It was a commodity, and by the 18th it was a craving, manufactured at industrial scale and paid for in blood. The Atlantic slave trade was driven in no small part by sugar. Enslaved Africans were transported to the Caribbean and the Americas to work on plantations. The product of their labor, sweet, white, and granulated, was shipped to Europe. There it was baked into cakes, stirred into tea, and sprinkled over the tongues of the elite. To rot in this context was a privilege. As we've seen, Queen Elizabeth I's blackened teeth were not seen as unfortunate, but fashionable, a sign of access, of luxury, decay as a statement piece. But the consequences trickled down. By the Industrial Revolution, sugar was no longer reserved for nobility. It was cheap, it was ubiquitous, it was added to everything. Not because it was healthy, but because it sold. Sweetness became the norm, and as it did, teeth began to fail. Children suffered first. Diaries from 19th century workhouses described children with no teeth left to eat bread. Dentists, when they existed, were overwhelmed. Newspapers printed letters from parents begging for affordable extractions. And yet sugar only became more common. It was added to medicines, to baby food, to bread. It was no longer a treat. It was the background noise of a modern diet. Governments knew, so did manufacturers, but the damage was invisible and slow, and so it was ignored. Teeth became silent casualties of empire, a hidden cost of indulgence, a kind of polite suffering, masked by packaging. Even today, sugar's legacy lingers. In addiction, in advertising, in aisles lined with color and promise, and in our mouths. Every cavity is a record. Every root canal, a confession, not of weakness, but of a system, centuries old, built to feed desire at any cost, including the enamel. Next, we meet the men responsible for removing teeth, not with ceremony, but with force, the barber surgeons. Before there were dentists, there were barbers, and not the kind who offer hot towels and polite conversation. Medieval barber surgeons were multi-talented fellows. They cut hair, they let blood, they lanced boils, they set bones, and yes, they pulled teeth. The iconic red and white barber poles still seen today originated from this era. The red represents blood, the white, bandages. Comforting, isn't it? Tooth extractions were a common request, and the barber surgeon obliged with grim efficiency. There were no licenses, no formal training, just a set of iron tools, a strong grip, and a willingness to work quickly. Patients would sit in a chair, or on a barrel, or anywhere really. They might bite down on leather, they might swig from a flask, or hold the hand of a relative until the pain passed. Or they did. The tools of the trade included forceps, keys, and pelicans, the last of which was a curved implement used to lever the tooth from the gum. They were not gentle, but they were fast. And in a world without antibiotics, speed could mean survival. Barber surgeons often worked in public, at markets, at fairs, in town squares. There are woodcuts, charming in their horror, showing teeth being yanked, while musicians play in the background. It was entertainment. It was necessity. It was unpleasant. But it was also the beginning of oral surgery. Crude, painful, necessary. Eventually the professions split. Barbers became barbers, surgeons became surgeons, and dentists, slowly, emerged as a field of their own. But for centuries, if you had a toothache, and some coin, and a tolerance for blood, the barber surgeon was your man. In the age before dentistry, and arguably before modesty, the lines between healing and grooming were remarkably thin. If you lived in medieval Europe and needed help with your teeth, your first stop might not have been a healer or a priest. It might have been your barber. The barber surgeon was a staple of village life. A man with a blade, a bench, and a surprising list of services. He could trim your beard, set your broken leg, lance your abscess, and if needed, remove your tooth, all before lunch. But oral care wasn't performed in isolation. It was part of a larger ritual, one that involved the body as a whole. Cleanliness, after all, was not about sterility. It was about humours, balance, flow. Which brings us to bathing. Contrary to myth, people did bathe in the Middle Ages. Public bathhouses were common in many towns, especially across the Islamic world and parts of Christian Europe. The water wasn't always clean. The practices weren't always modest, but the idea was consistent. A clean body made for a healthy soul, and sometimes a clean mouth. After a soak, it was not uncommon to rinse the mouth with wine, vinegar, or warm herbal infusions. This wasn't dental care in the modern sense, but it was something, a kind of hopeful swish designed more for freshness than hygiene. Then came the bloodletting. For centuries it was believed that illness came from imbalance, too much phlegm or bile or blood. To remove the excess was to restore order. And so, with a small cut of the knife or a leech behind the ear, the patient was relieved, sometimes permanently. Toothaches were thought to be related to heat or pressure or an overactive liver. And so, letting blood was the cure. If the ache remained, it simply meant not enough blood had been removed. Barbers became experts in these rituals, not through study, but repetition. They knew where to cut, where to swab, when to pray. And the red and white barber pole, still twirling today, is said to represent this history. The red for blood, the white for bandages, the pole itself perhaps the staff the patient clutched during the procedure. It is a curious thing that cleanliness, violence, and personal grooming all once came from the same chair. But in a world without microscopes or anesthesia, one took relief where it could be found. With hot water, with sharp steel, and hopefully with a steady hand.
Before the age of bristles and electric timers, tooth care was often a matter of household improvisation. In the centuries following the Middle Ages, people reached for what they had: salt, soot, ash, dried herbs, charcoal, and any number of powdered concoctions that promised to whiten, strengthen, or simply freshen. Most were applied with a cloth or a finger, sometimes with a small stick. The goal was to scrub away the evidence of the day, or, more optimistically, to prepare for courtship. Recipes varied by region. In England, a mixture of burnt bread and salt was popular. In France, powdered rosemary. In Italy, crushed brick. All were coarse, all were in some fashion effective, and most were mildly dangerous. Too much abrasion and the enamel wore down. Gums receded, teeth loosened. But it felt clean, and that was something. We also see the rise of the toothpick, again, now made from wood. Available in sets, carried in decorative cases. It was etiquette, it was appearance, it was a little touch of civility in a world that was still rather unhygienic. These were the early ancestors of modern dental products. Not quite paste, not quite polish, but a step forward. Next we meet someone altogether different. A man in prison with a small piece of animal bone and a rather clever idea.
William Addis wasn't the first man to contemplate hygiene while incarcerated, and he certainly wasn't the last. Prison, for all its brutality, is also a place of strange invention. There is time, there is pressure, and above all, there is a need, a human one, for control over the body. And so, like Addis, prisoners across centuries and continents have turned to toothbrushes, or rather to what they could turn into toothbrushes. The materials vary. Toothbrush shanks, as they are now called in prison slang, are typically made from melted plastic, the handle of a spoon perhaps, or a broken piece of a food tray. The bristles are crafted from scavenged sources, threads from a mop, shredded clothing, or smuggled nylon pulled from the seams of bedding. Some prisons allow toothbrushes, many do not. Not because they discourage hygiene, but because the toothbrush itself can become a weapon. File it down, harden it in boiling water, wrap it with tape, and you have something pointed and personal, a tool transformed. Still, for most inmates, it's not about violence. It's about normalcy. The act of brushing one's teeth becomes a ritual, something repetitive, something private, a quiet reclamation of the self in a place designed to erase it. In letters from 19th century American jails, inmates mention brushing not as hygiene but as penance. "I scrub my teeth like sin might come loose," wrote one man awaiting sentencing in 1872. In Soviet gulags, prisoners used chewed sticks, bones, or fabric. A toothbrush was a luxury, a smile, a small act of defiance. In modern solitary confinement, the toothbrush may be one of the last physical objects allowed in the cell. Prisoners snap it in half, then tape it to make it harmless. Some write messages on the handle, others carve tiny notches to mark the days, and across decades in secret some make art. Toothbrushes turned into paintbrushes, carved into tiny sculptures, or used as the base for crude tattoo guns. Creativity born not of inspiration but confinement. It's not hard to imagine Addis, centuries earlier, twirling a bit of bone in his hands, scraping, drilling, threading bristles through the holes, not as protest, not even as invention yet, just as a man trying to feel clean, in a place that wasn't. And so the toothbrush persists, not just as a tool of hygiene but of humanity. It is the smallest form of resistance, and sometimes the most profound. In 17th and 18th century Europe, getting ready was a performance. The toilette, derived from the French word for a small cloth or dressing table, was the morning ritual of the wealthy. And it involved everything: wigs, paints, rouge, perfume, and yes, dental care. A lady of status might sit at her vanity, surrounded by maids, and begin her transformation. First the face, then the hair, then with a bit of linen cloth, a dab of tooth powder. Some had silver tools, picks, scrapers, and scoops. Others used sticks wrapped in velvet. There were mirrors, there was music, there was conversation. The toilette was both private and performative. It was a social space, a place to receive visitors, to show one's refinement, to engage in gentle gossip while rubbing soot on one's incisors. Men had their own versions, often more subdued but no less involved. To polish one's shoes and one's teeth was a sign of dignity, and so tooth care became part of identity, of fashion, of routine. It was not scientific, but it was consistent, and that, in its own way, was progress. Next, we meet the man who would formalize that progress. A prisoner, a riot, and a toothbrush made from bone. The year is 1780. London. William Addis is in prison. The details vary. Some say it was for inciting a riot, others something more mundane. What matters is what he did while inside. He looked at his fellow inmates, rubbing their teeth with rags and soot, and thought, surely there's a better way. He saved a small animal bone from a meal. He drilled holes in one end. He gathered bristles, likely from a guard's broom, and he tied them into the bone with wire. A handle, bristles, a tool, the first modern toothbrush, born in a prison cell. When Addis was released, he didn't forget his invention. He refined it, produced more, and began to sell them. By the time of his death, his company was thriving, and remarkably, it still exists. Wisdom Toothbrushes, based in the UK, can trace its roots back to that small act of boredom and ingenuity in 1780. It is a rare thing to invent something in confinement and see it live on through centuries. William Addis never held a patent. He never gave a TED talk. He simply saw a problem and fixed it. And in doing so, he changed the way the world brushed its teeth. Next, we examine the curious materials of early brushes, bone handles, boar bristles, and why that combination wasn't always a good idea. The first modern toothbrushes were, by modern standards, a bit unsettling. The handles were made of bone, usually from cattle or pigs. It was a readily available material, and it could be carved, drilled, and smoothed by hand. Sturdy, lightweight, organic, and vaguely morbid. The bristles were worse. Harvested from the necks and backs of wild boars, often in Siberia, these bristles were stiff, coarse, and difficult to clean. But they had one undeniable feature. They held their shape, which for the task at hand, scraping the day's remains off the average 18th century tooth, was a useful trait. Less useful was their tendency to retain moisture and bacteria. Early toothbrushes, once used, were rarely dried properly. They sat damp in a glass or on a table, and boar bristles, being porous, became small, festering ecosystems. Over time, this led to infections, swollen gums, in rare cases, even sepsis, which, depending on your level of optimism, either made the toothbrush a triumph of hygiene or a deeply ironic death trap. Still, people kept using them, because the alternative was a rag soaked in salt, and so brushes were boiled, rinsed with vinegar, sun-dried. Household manuals offered elaborate instructions on how to keep your brush reasonably sanitary. None of it worked especially well, but the design held. Bone, bristles, a handle, a head. The form once born would remain. What would change? Slowly, stubbornly, were the materials. Next, we explore the rise of oral fashion. Toothbrushes for the elite, with silver handles, tortoiseshell cases, and a price tag that said, "I brush, therefore I belong." When the toothbrush left the prison cell, it didn't go directly to the dentist. It went to the factory. By the early 19th century, the gears of the Industrial Revolution were already in motion, churning out fabric, tools, and soon toothbrushes. Not one by one, but by the hundreds, then the thousands. William Addis, released from prison, did not waste his idea. He patented his design, hired workers, and founded what would become one of the first commercial toothbrush companies in England. The handles were made from cattle bone, the bristles from pig hair. They were marketed not as necessities, but as refinements, accessories for the grooming table, items to be tucked beside combs and cologne. The message was subtle. The well-dressed man now included his molars. Soon others followed. In France, in Germany, in the United States, factories began producing brushes in identical shapes, with identical slogans: cleanliness, modernity, self-respect. The brush became a product, and with it came its eternal companion, toothpaste. Or, more accurately, tooth powders made from chalk, charcoal, soap, and crushed shells, often flavored with peppermint or eucalyptus, sometimes with baking soda, occasionally with opium. By the mid-1800s, advertisements for dental products were appearing in newspapers, not as warnings, but as aspirations. A white smile meant success. Fresh breath meant virtue. Brands emerged. Competition followed. Soon, companies weren't just selling brushes, they were selling lifestyles. Posters depicted elegant ladies and stoic men, their teeth a symbol of discipline, their toothbrush a silent badge of order. In 1885, the first mass-produced toothbrush in America was sold in Connecticut. Within decades, they lined drugstore shelves. Wooden handles gave way to celluloid. Animal bristles were replaced with synthetic ones. Mass production had reached the bathroom. And yet, something was lost in the transition. Gone was the personal ritual, the carved bone, the reused cloth. In its place, packaging, price points, and promotions. It was the beginning of a paradox. The toothbrush, once a symbol of individual ingenuity, now a plastic echo of itself, durable, disposable, ubiquitous. The mouth had become a market, and we were all customers now.
As with most useful things, it didn't take long for the toothbrush to become a symbol of status. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the wealthy had brushes made not just from bone, but from ivory, mother of pearl, ebony wood, silver. Some had initials engraved on the handle, others were part of travel sets, cases lined with velvet containing brushes, combs, mirrors, and bottles of cologne. They were not left out on sinks. They were packed in leather rolls, carried by servants, tucked into trunks alongside silk gloves and shaving kits. To own a toothbrush was to show refinement, to own a beautiful one even more so. There were toothbrushes with gold trim, toothbrushes fitted with detachable heads. One, famously, included a small compartment in the handle for holding tooth powder, not practical, but clever. There is even record of Napoleon Bonaparte having a silver toothbrush inlaid with his initials, though whether he used it regularly is a subject best left to speculation. In portraits and estate records, brushes begin to appear, listed among personal effects, referred to as items of necessary luxury. Cleanliness, of course, was still only approximate, but appearance mattered, and the toothbrush, placed carefully beside the basin or displayed within a dressing case, was one more marker of being civilized. Next, we examine the hidden danger of these fine brushes, the bristles themselves, the hygiene problem no one wanted to admit, and the quiet deaths that followed. By the mid-1800s, the toothbrush had become both common and dangerous. The problem was the bristles, still made from boar hair, still porous, still deeply unhygienic. Once inserted into the bone or ivory handle, the bristles were almost impossible to clean thoroughly, and over time, as people brushed and rebrushed, the moist bristles harbored bacteria, lots of it. Medical journals of the era began to raise quiet concerns, cases of mouth infections, of mysterious swellings, of ulcers that refused to heal. In a few tragic instances, the infection spread from gum to jaw, from jaw to bloodstream, and the patient died of a toothbrush
It was rarely reported that way, of course. The death certificate would list sepsis or blood poisoning, but the root cause, more often than anyone liked to admit, was a damp brush, sitting quietly in a cup by the wash basin. Some manufacturers tried to fix the problem. They recommended boiling, rinsing, replacing bristles every few months. But habits are hard to change, and in an era without refrigeration, much less antiseptic standards, this advice was largely ignored. It is believed, though difficult to confirm, that at least a few people died directly because of their toothbrush. One man, in 1907, died of a gum infection traced to a contaminated brush. He had used it daily, faithfully, with the very best intentions, and it killed him. A cautionary tale wrapped in boar hair. Next, we enter the world of advertising, of patent medicine, of marketing genius and dubious claims. Toothpaste joins the fight, and the toothbrush begins to clean up its act.
If the Industrial Revolution gave the toothbrush a factory, television gave it a voice. By the mid-20th century, oral care was no longer a private matter. It had become a performance, a ritual of cleanliness staged for the camera, the crowd and the consumer. Early toothpaste ads were oddly intense. Grainy black and white footage showed smiling couples mid-dance, their grins exaggerated and luminous. 4 out of 5 dentists agree, a narrator would say, though no one ever asked the fifth. The mouth became a metaphor. A clean mouth meant a clean conscience. Bad breath meant bad character. Cavities suggested neglect, not just of teeth but of self. And the villains arrived in glorious technicolor. Cartoon germs, green and grotesque, swirled around molars like villains in a Saturday morning serial. They had names, voices, motivations. They were repelled by toothpaste, banished by floss, slain by fluoride. It was delightful. It was terrifying. It was profitable. Commercial jingles told us to brush 3 times a day, to fight plaque like a hero, to kiss with confidence. Children sang along. Parents nodded solemnly. Even toothbrushes gained personalities, talking to children about responsibility in gentle puppet voices. By the 1980s, dental products had fully entered the branding era. Toothpaste wasn't just minty, it was icy, explosive, or boldly whitening. Brushes weren't tools, they were engineered solutions. Curved heads, ergonomic grips, flexing bristles. Each new feature felt like a minor miracle. And somewhere in the background, dentists smiled from billboards and boxes, their arms folded across lab coats, always approving, always silent. Of course, not all mouths were welcome on screen. In beauty culture, white teeth became a demand, not a detail. Whitening strips, bleaching kits, laser treatments. A yellowed tooth became unthinkable, a crooked one, a flaw to correct. Smiles were edited, filters applied. Clean became sterile, symmetry became mandatory. We stopped seeing mouths as human and began seeing them as projects. Still, the messages stuck. Children grew up brushing not out of habit, but because their cartoon hero told them to. Adults bought mouthwash because it promised love, or respect, or fewer meetings interrupted by mints. Television didn't invent the toothbrush, but it did something more powerful. It made us afraid to be without it. Toothbrushes had been around for centuries, but for much of that time they worked alone. Until, that is, toothpaste entered the scene. The earliest pastes were homemade affairs: powdered charcoal, crushed mint, baking soda mixed with a touch of water. They cleaned, roughly, freshened, occasionally, foamed, never. By the mid-19th century, commercial toothpastes began to appear. Some came in tins, some in ceramic pots. All bore labels of great promise: whitens teeth, cures bad breath, strengthens the gums. There was, of course, little to no regulation. A paste could contain chalk or soap or powdered brick, and no one would raise an eyebrow. Still, people bought them because they wanted to believe in science, in health, in a cleaner, more modern mouth. Eventually, fluoride was introduced, a mineral that actually strengthened enamel and helped prevent decay. Not everyone trusted it. Some still don't. But from a dental standpoint, it was revolutionary. By the early 20th century, toothpaste was sold in collapsible metal tubes, easy to store, easy to squeeze, harder to ignore. And the toothbrush, for once, had a companion.
For centuries, people brushed to clean, to freshen, to maintain appearances, but they didn't know why it mattered. Not really. Then came the germ theory of disease. Championed by Louis Pasteur and others, it proposed that tiny, invisible organisms were responsible for infection. At first, people scoffed. Invisible threats, it sounded like superstition, but slowly the evidence mounted. And the toothbrush, which had once been seen as a cosmetic accessory, became a frontline tool in the battle against illness. Dental manuals were updated. Brushing was prescribed not just for beauty, but for health. Doctors urged regular oral hygiene. Schools began to teach children how to brush. Posters appeared in clinics and public baths. The toothbrush was now serious, and with seriousness came scrutiny. Brushing technique, brush storage, brush replacement schedules. A new language emerged: plaque, tartar, halitosis. The mouth was no longer just a space for talking and chewing, it was a battlefield. And the bristles, they were soldiers.
By the mid-20th century, a curious cycle had formed. On one side of the aisle, toothpaste, toothbrushes, fluoride floss. On the other, chocolate, caramel, lollipops, soda, both brightly packaged, both targeting children, both, in a quiet, relentless way, necessary because of each other. It was not a war, it was a partnership. The rise of candy as a cultural staple was no accident. In the post-war years, sugar rationing ended and production surged. Candy bars, once a luxury, became a pocket-sized reward. Something to hand a child, something to hand yourself, a pause, a pleasure. Halloween, once a modest harvest festival, was rebranded as a marketing juggernaut. Costumes were sold. Candy was mass-produced. The question was no longer if you'd get candy, but how much and what kind. The mouth became the battleground of a seasonal economy. Meanwhile, dental companies saw an opportunity. Toothbrushes were sold in Halloween-themed packs. Toothpaste commercials aired the week of October 31st with urgent tones. Don't let Halloween haunt your smile. Fear now was flavored like fruit punch. By the 1980s, cavities were no longer seen as medical, but moral. Did you brush enough? Did you floss? Did you try? Dental checkups began to include shame. Children were shown pictures of decay. Cartoon teeth cried. Lectures were issued about soda, gum, snacks. It was education, but it was also branding. Because for every new, sugar-coated invention, sour sprays, gummy worms, pop rocks, there was a corresponding dental solution. A new toothbrush head, a new formula, a new reason to brush, harder, longer, with more. One industry created the problem, the other sold the cure, and in the middle stood the mouth, obedient, anxious, and increasingly commodified. To be clear, there is nothing inherently wrong with candy. It is joy, crystallized, a brief moment of brightness, but when paired with capitalism, it becomes something more cunning, a loop, a self-feeding cycle of indulgence and correction, reward and repair. And so, we chew, we brush, we rinse, we chew again. And through it all, the economy smiles, unnaturally white. With growing awareness of bacteria came new expectations for hygiene, especially in the home. Housewives' manuals in the late 19th and early 20th centuries contained elaborate instructions for cleaning not just clothing and linens, but toothbrushes. Boil them once per week, one suggested. Rinse daily in carbolic acid, advised another. Children were told never to share brushes. Mothers were warned not to keep brushes too close to the toilet.
Brushes were to be dried carefully, inspected, replaced often. This, of course, was aspirational. Many households could not afford such luxuries. A single brush might serve an entire family, hung by the hearth, used until the bristles fell out. Still, the conversation had changed. Toothbrushes were no longer curiosities. They were necessities, and the domestic rituals around them reflected a growing understanding that cleanliness could be preventive. Disease, it turned out, could be scrubbed away, or at least slightly delayed. Next, we leave natural materials behind and welcome the marvel of modern chemistry: nylon. In 1938, DuPont, the American chemical giant, introduced something entirely new: the nylon bristled toothbrush. No animals, no boiling, no questionable hygiene. Just clean, uniform, synthetic filaments attached to plastic handles and sold in shiny cardboard boxes. It was the beginning of the modern brush. Nylon offered many advantages. It dried quickly, it resisted bacterial growth, it held its shape better than hog hair ever could. It was at last a truly hygienic option. The public was skeptical at first. Plastic, in the mouth, it felt unnatural. But advertising helped, and wartime shortages of natural materials pushed innovation into the mainstream. By the 1950s, boar bristles were largely gone, replaced by synthetic ones manufactured by the millions. Toothbrushes were now colourful, durable, affordable. They came with slogans, with smiling dentists, with promises of science-backed freshness. No more ivory, no more silver, just sleek lines and plastic efficiency. Next, the brush gets a battery and a button, and a faint, reassuring hum. Electricity enters the bathroom, and brushing goes bionic. The year was 1954, the place, Switzerland, and the object, a toothbrush that plugged in. It was called the Broxident, and it was the first commercially available electric toothbrush. Originally designed for patients with limited motor skills, it quickly found an eager market among those who liked the idea of doing less. It buzzed, it whirred, it promised convenience. Brushing now was a matter of guidance, not effort. The first models were large, bulky, often tethered to the wall by a long cord, but they worked, and they intrigued. By the 1960s, battery-powered versions appeared. By the 1980s, rotating heads and sonic waves had entered the scene. By the 1990s, smart timers. By the 2000s, Bluetooth. The electric toothbrush had arrived, and with it, a new era of oral automation. No longer just a tool, it was a gadget. Next, we explore the modern oral care landscape: apps, sensors, subscriptions, and a toothbrush that may just know more about your habits than you do. Somewhere along the way, toothbrushes stopped being simple. They started being smart. Today, you can buy a brush that tracks your movements, evaluates your technique, and sends a report to your phone. It can tell if you've missed your molars, if you're pressing too hard, if you've brushed for 1 minute and 43 seconds instead of the prescribed 2. You can earn badges, get reminders, sync your brushing habits to the cloud. There are brushes that glow, brushes that coach, brushes that scold, all in the name of oral excellence. It is, and this is not an exaggeration, the gamification of plaque. But do these things work? Sometimes. It depends, mostly on whether you use them. The old rule still applies. The best toothbrush is the one you actually use. Still, there's a strange comfort in it all. To live in an age where technology watches over your enamel is, in its own way, a kind of luxury. Next, we consider the toothbrush not as a tool, but as a ritual, a moment of quiet, a gesture of care. Twice a day, every day, for years. You do it without thinking, a few minutes in the morning, a few before bed. In a world of chaos, it is one of the few constants. The toothbrush, like a metronome, quietly keeps time. You stand, you brush, you stare at the mirror, you consider your face, your day, your life. There is something intimate about it, unspoken. To clean one's teeth is to admit that one plans to go on. It is maintenance, but it is also hope. You brush not only for today's smile, but for tomorrow's. To brush is to say, I'm still here. And that is something.
For all the talk of toothbrushes, one might assume they look and work the same everywhere. They don't. Brushing, like everything else, is shaped by culture, geography, belief, even music. In parts of Africa, the toothbrush is still a twig, not out of poverty, but preference. Twigs from the Salvadora persica tree, also known as the toothbrush tree, are chewed until the end phrase forming natural bristles. It cleans, it freshens. It has for centuries. In India, neem sticks serve the same purpose, slightly bitter, antiseptic, and widely respected in Ayurveda. They are sold in morning markets by the bundle. Some are soaked in water overnight, others are rubbed with charcoal or salt. The practice is old and still alive. In Japan, brushing is almost ceremonial. Children sing songs while brushing. Schools schedule brushing time after lunch. There are mirrors in classrooms. There are charts, and there is pride, not just in clean teeth, but in collective hygiene. In South America, brushing blends modernity with tradition. Toothbrushes are common, but so are herbal rinses, chamomile, guava leaves, peppermint. Ingredients chosen not for branding, but for belief. In Islamic cultures, the use of the miswak, a cleaning stick made from the arak tree, is both hygienic and spiritual. The Prophet Muhammad recommended it, and today it's used before prayer, before sleep, before important events. The miswak isn't just a tool, it's a gesture. And in many rural communities worldwide, brushing means cloth, a piece of cotton, a dab of salt, a few careful strokes across the teeth, guided by memory. No timer, no minty foam, just habit and care. Even in places where modern brushes are common, their meaning varies. In the United States, brushing is often tied to appearance. In Scandinavia, to routine. In Thailand, to freshness. In Nigeria, to social status. There is no one way to brush, and perhaps there never was, because brushing is not just about teeth, it's about identity, belonging, ritual, a private act with public consequences. We carry our culture in our mouths, and every brush, whether plastic or twig, electric or cloth, is a reminder. Clean is not one thing, it is many.
When the body is gone, the teeth remain. They do not decay like flesh, they do not crumble like bone. They persist, white, silent, and unmistakably human. A final trace. A closing sentence. In museums, we stare at them. Fossils from a Pleistocene child, the worn molars of a pharaoh, the clenched jaw of a medieval saint. Sometimes they are behind glass, sometimes set in gold, sometimes hidden, embedded in the shadows of a reconstructed skull. They are always there. Teeth are strange relics, part tool, part bone, part biography. They carry evidence, not just of age, but of habit. What we ate, what we lacked. How hard we clenched through winters and war. To study a tooth is to read a life in reverse. And so it's no surprise that we imbue them with meaning, that we mourn them when they fall out, that we bury them, toss them, keep them in velvet boxes, that we believe in fairies who come to collect them, that we whisper to children that something lost will bring a reward. Because even when we leave them behind, they do not leave us. The toothbrush, in its quiet way, is an acknowledgement of this, a daily ritual of respect, a small apology to the body for what it must endure, a gesture toward the future, when the rest of us may be forgotten, but the molars will still be telling stories. Somewhere, someone will find them. Someone will wonder who we were. And someone perhaps will smile, a little, at the evidence that we once cared enough to clean them. So here's to the brush, to the ritual, to the strange, stubborn little bones that outlive everything else. The mouth closes, but it never disappears. Through war, through peace, through invention and inconvenience, the toothbrush has endured. It has changed shape, changed size, changed color and function and cultural meaning. But it remains a small tool, a quiet habit, a thing we do so routinely we barely notice. And yet it matters. It reminds us that small things done consistently can have lasting effects. The toothbrush isn't glamorous, it isn't impressive, it doesn't solve your problems, but it shows up twice a day like a very quiet friend. Which brings us at last to where we began. Yes, it happened. A man, faithful in his hygiene, used the best brush money could buy. Bone handle, boar bristles. He brushed daily, he did everything right, but the bristles, uncleaned, damp, loaded with bacteria, they turned against him. A small wound in the gum, an infection, sepsis, death. A toothbrush that killed. It was rare, it was tragic, and it changed the way we think about cleanliness. The irony lingers that a tool meant to preserve life could end it, but that is the nature of tools. They reflect our intentions, and so we learn, we adapt, we improve. Today, your toothbrush is safer than ever. So safe, in fact, it may have become something else entirely. A ritual, a meditation, a small plastic monument to continuity. You may not think about it often. You may never think of it again. But tonight, when you reach for it, when you stand in the soft light of your bathroom, when you lift it to your mouth and begin to scrub, remember this. A toothbrush once killed a man, and yours, very likely, will not. Sleep well and brush gently. Good night.